Hi there. Thank you for joining us, Alison. So nice to meet you. We really loved reading your
Likewise.
book.
Thank you.
I'll start with a quick introduction of who you are. Alison is a Canadian writer, playwright, and performer. Her essays and stories have been awarded a National Magazine Award Gold Medal, a Western Magazine Award First Prize, and she's been a finalist for the Journey Prize. Her books have been nominated for the RBC Taylor Prize, shortlisted for the Edna Stabler Award for Creative Nonfiction, selected as an Indigo Top Pick, and have become national bestsellers. Her numerous theater awards include Best Dramatic Script at the world's largest festival of solo theater at New York City's United Solo. And Alison is also the creator and facilitator of Memoir-writing-ink, an interactive online program that guides people through the process of transforming personal stories into memoirs. Thank you so much for joining us here at Memoir Mentors. We're a group that meets online every Thursday, and we have a book club every 6 weeks or so. We finished reading your book recently and really enjoyed it. The book was Confessions of a Fairy's Daughter. And this was quite different for us because this book was not written as many memoirs are just about the author themselves. This one had a lot, obviously, about your father and your relationship with your father and how his being gay and coming out affected you as well as your mother. Really enjoyed the book and really looking forward to speaking with you. How about you tell us first off, was there a moment of inspiration? You knew you wanted to write this book, or did the idea come gradually, or did someone ask you to write this?
I think it was a story I knew I would always write at some point, but I had to wait until the fruit was ripe, as it were. And I was actually working on something else that wasn't going terribly well. And I was just looking for a way to keep the gears moving, but not get stuck in this one project. And I remembered the scene, the moment when my mom told me my dad was gay. I was 12. I was going to Germany the next day on a gymnastics exchange. It was just a very high tension moment. And I often tell people when they don't know where to start writing their story, I always ask them, well, if you were to go where the energy is, where is that? Where does that take you? Because that's often a really pivotal moment in the story. And it can be helpful to locate those sorts of emotional axes in a story. And so I just started there. And I did that sort of psychic scuba diving that one does when one's looking for details in memory. So it was a long process, but as I got into the story, I was surprised, as many people are, how much was available to me, how much memory, when I really took the time to probe around, how much memory was actually available. And so I assembled that scene, and I actually then tried to find ways to include other scenes then started presenting themselves that were related to that story. And I tried to weave them into the project that wasn't going very well. I had this vague idea that they were, kind of obliquely maybe related, and that didn't work. But I'd started the story.
I loved that moment that you were describing, that pivotal moment of getting the news from your mother and sitting there on that stool. The way you described the thump of moving the step with your foot was just so well done, and it just really ramped up the tension. It was really interesting the way you chose to describe that. It really felt like we were there and we could feel that tension. And the prelude, your father gives you this box, this treasure trove, you called it, of his own writing and articles about being gay and coming out. And then you take the box upstairs, and I think he thought that you weren't going to write about him. And he says, oh, that's good. That's good that you decided to write about the broader gay movement and its political history. Did you ever think that you would write just about that, or it was always your intent to write his story?
Well, it was always my intent to write my story, and so his story as it pertained to my own, I suppose. But I was also very aware that I needed a larger backdrop, that my little story is only ever my little story, as our own little stories are only that, which doesn't make them any less valuable, but they begin to speak to others when they have universal resonance of some kind, which doesn't mean this thing happened to everybody. It means there is something about this story that a large number of people can resonate with. It may be, in my case, it was my father's sexual orientation that was the great secret. But in other people's cases, it's, an alcoholic parent or a suicidal sibling or a mental illness in the family or something, something that the person is keeping hidden from the world and forced to wear a mask over, so we can parade around saying, oh no, we're just fine like everybody else. I mean, I think a lot of people can relate to that, can relate to the idea that families are not perfect. Ha ha. Yeah, let's put that out there. So I knew that it was my story, my small story about my father, but it was also, he unwittingly was at the forefront of the gay liberation movement in Canada. No one knew it at the time, of course. People who are at the forefront of revolutions rarely know it in that moment. They can't really see the sea of change that's going to come behind them. But it was important that my family was going through something that the country as a whole was also going through, and to a large extent, to a lesser extent, the world, but certainly the United States and parts of Europe. There was some sort of energy that was moving through, and my family was part of that. Mm-hmm. So I knew I wanted to have that backdrop, but I wasn't sure how I was going to do it until he handed me that box that you spoke of, which was the great turning point. Because so it's important, I should mention that I wrote the story first as a script of a one-woman show, which I toured for a year. Mm-hmm. But that script was only my story. It was only my point of view. And so I expanded that I took the script and expanded it into a larger story, a larger memoir, but that only took up, it was fewer than 200 pages before that story was done. And I was aware, I just felt there's nothing else that's longing to be spoken about from my side. So I was in search of that larger story. And I went to talk to my dad, and my intent had been to interview him and get his suggestions for where should I do some research, where should I start, are there any books I should be reading, people I should be talking to. I was just doing the first sort of steps into that part of the project, which I imagined would be actually quite lengthy. Mm-hmm. And then he, in response to one of my questions, handed me this box, which was full of diaries, letters, newspaper clippings, magazine articles from the time.
So wonderful.
And as soon as I saw the box, as soon as I read the first item from the box, I knew, oh, okay, here it is. I mean, forget going into the gay archives. I've been handed everything I need right here.
Well, so wonderful. You did include some articles and some history. Was it challenging to find the balance between the personal and the broader stories?
Well, it was challenging to figure out how to present that material, because at first I imagined that I would weave it into my own. And either I would have alternating chapters, his story, my story, his story, my story, but it didn't work. It stole the reveal moment, really, mm-hmm. because if you know at the beginning that my dad is searching for this, then what I wanted was to present the reader with something of my experience, which was I grew up thinking I had a heterosexual dad, and he was just a heterosexual dad who happened to be very playful and like making pastry and singing and dancing around the garden, pretending to be a butterfly. I mean, I just thought that's dad, and it was dad, but we were, if I wove his story in, I'd steal all of that from the reader. The reader would never get to have that moment, those moments of sort of innocence. And so I really wrestled with what to do with it. And I went back and forth trying different things. And then at one point, I think I realized, no, it's its own story. My story is my story in my own words. And the strength of this, because there was a point where I was trying to use I was trying to thread a narrative through his material.
Mhm.
And it just didn't work. It just kept falling apart. And so I don't remember the day that I realized I actually just have to let all of this sit on its own and just choose, because I had to leave out a lot. It was a big box with lots of stuff in it. So I had to pull only the most salient details out. And so it was important, for example, that a newspaper article be included that show the thinking of the time, which was, this is a mental illness, you can recover from it, et cetera, et cetera. Now and also it was important that there was no sense that the word gay and father would ever belong in the same sentence. No one had imagined it at that time. That was vital. So I knew the key pieces, and then it was just a matter of, finding the rhythm of information and story.
And how did you have to do anything special to get permission to use those articles, or how did that process go?
No, every person whose letters I included had died.
Okay.
I guess I did contact, though, the son of one of the men whom I mentioned, my dad having kind of I don't think they actually had a thing, but he was very instrumental in my dad's first steps into sort of gay bars and things like that. And I did contact him and sent him those pages just so that he was okay with the way that I just, conveyed his dad and their interaction.
Okay. And as far as like the articles that you included, as long as you, just for our
they were
memoirists,
cited.
as long as you cite it, you can use it.
Yeah. Well, that's sort of the publisher. I didn't really get involved in that because they do all of that stuff. So I just included all the citations, and then whatever permissions needed to be sought, they did that.
Okay. Okay, great. And did you find it difficult to choose your terminology or tone when referring to the LGBTQ plus community or individuals?
Actually, I think it's +2S.
Okay.
Plus, yeah. Here you have to say 2S because it's also two-spirited. I mean, I'm sure people, no, I didn't, but I was fortunate maybe in that this book preceded the addition of, I have really mixed feelings about how hyper-specific we now have to be whenever we discuss anything, lest we offend someone who is not somehow reflected in all of the initials that need to be added. I mean, you can hear it in my voice. I think what I find tiresome is that I don't know how helpful it is to be continually insulted to feel that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how inviting it is to other people. And when I was a part of a queer family, there was no such thing as queer families. So, and having a gay dad, there was no such thing. We didn't have a word yet for it. I mean, we sort of cobbled it together. Mm-hmm. The terminology did not matter nearly as much as the love that we shared in the acceptance we chose to offer. Right. And I maintain that to this day. It actually doesn't matter to me. It matters far less to me how many letters are used than the spirit with which those, I think there are a lot of older people, for example, who are terrified to open their mouths and terrified to enter into any discussion because they don't want to offend anyone. I don't think that's helpful. For the larger movement, I think the more inviting and engaging and accepting we can be, we model that.
Yes.
Model that for other people. So if someone wants to say, whatever, someone wants to use the wrong language when they're referring to me. I've been called queer spawn, all these different things. I don't actually take it. I really am more interested in how do they look at me? How do they look at my father? How welcome are we in their lives? That's ultimately what matters to me, but I'm not really concerned about the letter.
And did you, have you had feedback from that community? How has this book been received?
Well, it came out in 2013 and it was would say very warmly embraced, because there are so few books that have been written by kids. Now, really young people, like high school age, early university, they take offense at the word fairy, or have done. And I've had debates in readings about that. And I give them much the same answer that I just gave you, that it was never that term places. The reason I use the term is, I mean, what's interesting is the fairy in question has no issue with it.
Right.
Neither do any of his friends, because that's how they referred to one another in those days. So it places the story very definitively in an era, and it's used only and ever endearingly. And that's what matters. And if we can't, I mean, the power is when we co-opt language, when we take something that was hurled at us as an epithet and say, okay, I'm owning this actually. Yeah. And suddenly the power is gone. The power to have it used against us is gone. I mean, it's sort of like the pussy thing with Donald Trump. When tens of thousands of women gathered in Washington and said, the pussies are here, all of a sudden, it was a word of power. I mean, right. It was a pussy march. That is an amazing thing. That's what the power of language actually has in it. That's how we can use language to our own, yes. to our own benefit, and I think to the benefit of others too.
Speaking of language, I love your use of metaphors throughout this book. You have such beautiful metaphors. Like one of my favorites was, my father flitted in and out of our nest, the nest of our lives, like most men of his time. But I thought of my mother as the spiral of sticks itself, her limbs, the very twigs that held our home together. And I was wondering if you could give us some tips, like, how do you write these metaphors? Do you have, when you're in your first draft, do you already have them in mind, or is it something you come back and add later? And does it come natural to you, or is there some tips you can have for us?
Well, I think the only tip I can give is read poetry. That's where it all comes from. I mean, when I'm writing memoir, I don't read memoir. I read poetry pretty much exclusively. And so I think that's the fount of most language of metaphor. And so we can just drink from that, and that's Beautiful. Where they come from.
All right. You obviously love memoirs. You've written 3 so far: Moments of Glad Grace, Honeymoon in Purda, and this one. How do you decide what the start is, what the ending is, and if there's overlap, how you handle that?
You mean the start of one memoir versus the other? Oops, sorry. Well, I should say my first book, Honeymoon in Purda, was never considered a memoir until memoirs became popular, and then they, I think, changed the genre. It was what was called travel literature at the time. You don't really have that anymore. I don't know why. It's probably not in vogue anymore. But so I didn't consider that a memoir, and I consider myself the artist in that book rather than the subject, because the subject to me it's a series of portraits of Iranian people. So even though it's told in the first person and it uses my eyes, I don't consider it a memoir, and yet, as I say, now it's classified as one. So, but for Confessions, it was very clear to me that the story began really with my first memory, and it ended when I came out as the daughter of a gay man. I mean, that was sort of the clear arc, that it would go to about the age of 23, when I had this moment of seeing my dad conducting the Toronto Gay Men's Choir, and I had this moment of intense love and pride for him. So it was very clear, that arc. And then, a lot of things have happened since then, but that's the danger of memoir, is that we try to include too much, that we
right.
do, that the challenge in memoir, as you all know, is not deciding what to write about. It is just deciding what not to write about, what to leave out so that a central story can emerge. That's the key.
Yes.
And most people try to include way, way, way too much. And I've made that mistake in other writing projects. That one I referenced earlier in this interview, where the project wasn't going very well, it was trying to do too much. and it's never been completed. So, we all have false starts. And most of the time it's because we're trying to gallop off in too many directions at once. So with Moments of Glad Grace, by that point, I didn't start that as a book. I thought I was writing a 20-page essay because I went to Ireland with my dad and basically nothing happened. I didn't think, oh, what a great book this will be. But I was very inspired to write about it. And I loved the long form essay. That was really where I cut my writing teeth, was in that long form essay, which doesn't really exist anymore because none of us have any attention spans anymore, or rather we're told that our attention spans are about 750 words. Whereas in the days when I was starting to write, we wrote 20 and 30 page essays and they were published in magazines and people read them. They sat down and did this, flipped multiple pages until they got to the end, an experience one rarely witnesses now. So that's why I started to write. I started to write what I thought was a 20-page essay or 30 page, whatever. I thought it was a long form essay. But then I got to about page 10 and I was still in the airport and I thought, oh God, I think this is going to be longer. And so, but I was really helped by the fact that it had been a very short trip. When I teach memoir, I talk extensively to people about the container. The container for your story is what will allow you to write it. It will allow you to write it without being overwhelmed. It will allow you to finish it. Without a container, the story has the potential to go everywhere at once and therefore nowhere. And so the smaller the container, paradoxically, the bigger the story can be, because suddenly you have a center of gravity. Suddenly you have a place to return to. And so I felt, okay, within we were actually there 2 weeks, but I wasn't going to write about 2 weeks. So I condensed it into one. So now I had 1 week. And in 1 week, we had this series of things that we were doing, but what I was actually interested in exploring were the themes of identity and truth and ancestry. And the smaller a container I had, the better chance I had of being able to look at those things.
And the container for Confessions of a Fairy's Daughter was what you spoke of earlier, of your first memories of your father, and then about age 23. And that was and you're focusing on this arc of both of you coming out.
Yeah. And that story. So to the exclusion of my mother, who is a very interesting person and deserves her own book and her own story. But if I was going to start doing that was going to be a disaster, or not disaster, but a tangent that would have taken me off track. I could have explored relationships with my brother, things that happened to me in high school, my own relationships. I could have gone in so many places. So the container for that story was not just a container of time, but of a singular relationship, mine with my father and his coming out, which didn't mean those characters didn't make appearances, but they only made appearances where they were relevant to this other story. Yeah, and that's another thing that I think people can really benefit from being aware of is this person, the person, the scene, the story, the anecdote, the episode only belongs if it pushes the larger story along.
Yes, thank you. That's so helpful. How long did it take you to write this memoir? Was it longer or shorter than some other ones?
No, it was pretty quick, but it was quick because I'd written the script first. So I had, in some ways, a skeleton that I lay down and then just had to find flesh for it. So it was so clear where the arc was so clear, the basic bones of it were so clear. So I think I remember actually I'd been touring for a year and I got a grant, or I applied for a grant to write the book. And I think it was, I sort of sat down in September, but I sat down in September with a lot. I'd done a lot of preliminary writing, even not just beyond the script. Scenes that got cut from the show were still there, and they were there fully formed. I'd really worked them, so I could just pick them up and put them places. So it's hard to say, but the process of assembling it was kind of an 8-9 month project. And then my dad's piece, that was another, I remember I took it to Mexico. So that was probably another 3 months of working with that material and trying to figure out the shape of it. And let's tack on another 3 months or so. It was short. For me, it's short. I'm not a really I'm not a prolific kind of writer. I tend to agonize over sentences and for long periods.
Me too.
Yeah. So for me, it was quick, but I can't remember. I can't remember. And then there's that awful delay. I think it was then 2 years before it actually got published, or 18 months or something while it was in production and so on.
Mm-hmm. So the one woman show didn't include your father's story.
No.
Okay.
Yeah. And when the book came out, I went back to my director and said, do we add? And we actually tried. And I recorded my dad reading some of that stuff, and we were going to somehow have him be present at different points, or have his voice be present in different parts of the show. And then we both realized really quickly, we're messing with something that is whole already. And this is if people want my dad's story, they can buy the book, but my show is my story. So.
Okay. Is it something that you're still doing from time to time, or is that show done?
Well, the last show I did was right before the world tipped over, March 2020, when theater shut down. I'd just done it. I mean, within the 2 weeks earlier, I think I ended up being one of the last shows in the theater. And since then I haven't, I'm thinking of pulling it up again for 2023 because it'll be the 10th year anniversary. But I haven't decided yet.
Are you working on another book right now?
No, all of my creative energy right now is going into this thing called Memoir-writing-ink, which began as this little proposition. I mean, this little idea I had because I've done a lot of teaching, and it's turned into this much bigger. It's a creative venture of its own. So I'm actually, my goal in 2023 is to return to my own writing, because at the moment I'm the only person in Memoir-writing-ink not writing, which is painful irony, but that's what it's been. It's been fine, but right now I'm feeling the itch again.
Mm-hmm. I've been enjoying, I just signed up recently for your newsletters.
All right.
I'm enjoying reading those.
Good, thank you.
And I know that Sylvia has taken one of your courses and really enjoyed it. So we'll share a link in the YouTube notes to your group. Tangina is asking if you have any guidance on how many chapters or how long a memoir should be.
It should be the length it needs to be to tell your story. That is the answer. I mean, there's no optimum length. There's no minimum requirement. One of the best memoirs, I think, that's now a classic, is Jan Morris's Conundrum, which is maybe 100 pages. And it tells an enormous story so beautifully and so fully. There's nothing missing from that. And then I just read Susan Faludi's, I have it right here. I just finished it this morning, In the Darkroom, which is a brilliant memoir. And it's a big brick of a thing, 500 pages. So there's you can feel a lot of freedom to give the story the shape it needs, and not to feel that you need to fit into any sort of structure or framework that most people do. I mean, probably the common length is somewhere between 250 and 350. But it doesn't even matter. It doesn't matter. A memoir, a brilliant memoir, can be 10 pages, it can be 2 pages, and it can be 600. So give it the length it needs. Mm-hmm. That goes for chapters too. Chapter can be 1 page, 10 pages, and it can alternate. They do not have to be uniform.
Mm-hmm. I'm taking, I've got a mentorship right now with someone at the University of Iowa. And that was one of my questions was, I felt like my chapters needed to be a certain length. And he said, no, he would actually prefer to have varying lengths of chapters. So there's really no formula. Yeah. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the publishing process. Did you already have this publisher for your other books that you went with, or did you have an agent? How did that process go? Yeah, I had an agent. So I did, I think, probably I made the most traditional or the most common series of steps to publishing, in that I started publishing really small things in really small journals.
And then some of those things won awards. And so that got me, recognized. And then by the time I published chapters of the book in little obscure journals that no one reads. But that meant by the time I was then querying an agent, I said, this chapter was published here and was nominated for this. This chapter was published here and it won this. And so it stood out. I mean, what people I think should know, and which isn't often talked about, is my agent receives over 100 unsolicited manuscripts per week in her office, per week.
Wow.
So they don't read them. They cannot possibly read them, even when they hire people to go through the slush pile. What people read when they go through the slush pile are the cover letters. And if your cover letter says, this has been published here, I've been published here, 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 and here, this chapter has appeared here, you have a chance of being read. But really, I think realistically, if your cover letter says, here is my book, I hope you like it, it's not going to get read.
Yeah.
I mean, that, and I don't mean that to be cruel. I mean that to be kind. I mean, that people should know that, because then we know where to focus our efforts. The place to focus your efforts, if you want to be published, is in publishing small things, even if they are in small places. That matters way more. Well, that is going to get you faster to what you're looking for, which is, it's very difficult to publish without an agent. So the agent is, unless you want, there are sort of 4 self-publishing. So it's all up to you. The door is open. But you have to hire an editor, hire a copy editor, hire a designer, and so on. But you have full control, and it can be on your schedule, which is great. So there are a lot of advantages to self-publishing. Then there's something called hybrid publishing, which is a place that has an editorial board. So they accept or reject manuscripts, but you pay for everything up front. And so that's a hybrid model. And in Canada, there are some really good hybrid publishers. There are some really not great ones, so just beware. But there are some really good ones, and that can be a really beautiful way to go. And I actually just did that for a friend who died shortly after her memoir was published. Her memoir was finished, and together with her husband and mom, we approached a hybrid publisher and did it that way. And that was a great project. It just came out yesterday, in fact. And then, so that's maybe tier 2. And then tier 3 are the independent publishers, which are small and easier to approach. They are also inundated with manuscripts, unsolicited manuscripts, however. So that scene that I described applies equally to these small publishers, but they don't require you to go through an agent. And then the last tier are the big ones. So Random House, Penguin, Macmillan, those big ones, nothing. If it doesn't come from an agent, it doesn't get looked at. So there's no point in even sending something to them. And so I think also it's just important to know where to put your energy when you're exploring that. I approached an agent, and then I had my manuscript for Honeymoon in Purda finished. I sent it to her, and then she sold it to Alfred Knopf, which is now part of Random House Penguin. And so that was the same publisher as Confessions.
We've really been trying to focus lately in our group to get published in smaller places. So it's encouraging, motivating to hear you say this. Do you have any suggestions on where to find a place to get published, or anything you can offer as far as getting those smaller pieces out there?
Yeah. Within Memoir-writing-ink, we have a whole list. One of the things we did, one of the people who works in Memoir-writing-ink, I sent her on a research mission to come up with lists of magazines, journals, online publications, and then small publishers who were looking specifically for memoir. So there's a whole list. I don't really even know where to start, except that Google is your best friend where that's concerned. And then I guess the only thing I would say is it's really important to read back issues of whatever publication you are sending to. There is no point in just sending your stuff out to 10 magazines you've never read. There's no point. And the magazine's editor will be insulted if they feel that you have never read their publication.
Yeah.
So, and they should be, not insulted maybe, but maybe I should rephrase that. It behooves every writer to investigate the publication, vet themselves as a potential writer for that publication, to feel a resonance with what they publish or not, and approach the publisher, approach the editor of that magazine, or whoever the submissions editor is, with an understanding of the magazine and why you genuinely and truly believe your writing belongs there. That is going to help you. Mm-hmm. It's both going to help you place your piece, but it's also going to help you not query the wrong magazines and then get rejections that make you feel terrible.
So do you write in your cover letter and pitches, do you write, I've heard different guidance on submissions of whether you just have it short and sweet, or whether you have some more information.
Short and sweet. Oh, there's no question. Short and sweet is the way to go. But within short and sweet, you can also talk about their magazine, articles that you've read in the past that you've really enjoyed and that have made you feel that they might be interested in thing. That you don't need a lot of words to say that, and it goes a long way.
Great, thanks for that. So you've won a number of prizes and awards, and I wondered, how does that process look? Is this something that have you entered a lot of contests, or does your work just get noticed? And after you get so many out there, how does that work?
So in my case, the journals themselves submitted the pieces to the contest. So I didn't have to. That was lucky. Okay. So I wasn't even aware that it was happening. I just got the phone call that I won. No, that's the amazing thing. So I didn't even, if I hadn't won, I wouldn't have even felt disappointed because I didn't know. So that's how that works. And that's the advantage. I mean, these little, when I say these little literary journals that no one reads, I mean, I'm being facetious somewhat. They have a very small readership. It's not Oprah, but they have the advantage of those literary journals is that they do have really strong editorial boards. You have a measure of credibility from an agent or a publisher for just having published there, and they do submit work to things like the National Magazine Awards or whatever it is. You can't just I don't think you can't sort of nominate your own piece, I don't think, for a National Magazine Award, or I'm not even sure how it works, but I believe they only take nominations from magazines. They're only interested in previously published work, and previously published work from sort of a recognized group of magazines and journals.
Have you received any backlash from anyone you wrote about, or any? How has that experience been? Has it primarily been a positive experience?
Yeah, I got lucky. I think maybe it was also the time that it came out. People weren't as on edge about things. I mean, it's very possible that if I published right now, I'd get a lot of angry letters. Yeah. I didn't. I mean, and I've had the odd person take issue with the word fairy when I do a reading or something, but it tends not. I've never had anything hurled at me or anything. Right. Everyone gets the odd angry note, but I just actually don't read them. When I realize, oh, this is what this is, I don't really take those in. I don't find it very useful.
And what about the family? Did Aunt Dot ever come around?
No, she died without speaking to my dad.
Oh, yeah. So sad.
Yeah, it's amazing that she held out right to the end. And yeah, it was just my dad was just here actually with Michael maybe a few weeks ago, and we were sitting out on the back deck with a glass of wine, and my dad lifted the glass and said, Dot would have been 90, or Dot would have been 100 today.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, like it's still, he still thinks of her, still celebrates her birthdays. Amazing.
And what did your dad think about the book?
Well, initially, he was a little reticent. I remember him saying, "Ooh, I don't know if I want my neighbors to know about what I was up to in the baths." And I remember him saying, "Oh, the ladies at the Genealogical Society will never look at me the same way again." But that was pre-publication. I mean, I didn't have anyone read. Everybody has a different take on this and a different level of comfort about sharing a work before it's published. And I think it depends on your family. I chose not to show the book to anybody, the manuscript to anybody but my dad. And I only showed him the first and the second sections because I wanted to know that I got it right. I wasn't really interested in his opinion, but I didn't want to have made any mistakes. And when I gave him that, I mean, by then I had a contract, I had everything. We were sort of away. Is that right? I don't remember, but I do remember him being very uncomfortable about it. And actually it being a very awkward breakfast because I'd given to him the afternoon before, and then he sat and read it in the evening. I went to bed. And then the next day at breakfast, it was, clink, 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 clink. Oh. And finally I said, I don't have to do this. If this is going to make you uncomfortable, I have the show, I'll just do the show. And he said, well, that's when he said, I just don't know. And he said, I don't know how many people are even going to be interested in my diaries. I mean, I see the relevance. Can you imagine your own diaries being published? I mean, no. So I just said, well, look, it's not worth it to me. I mean, I don't have to publish it. So if it's going to really bother you, I won't do it. And he said, well, let's just sleep on it. And then, so we went about our business that day. And I think we had dinner together with Michael and we didn't talk about it. And then the next day, we woke up and he said, look, I've given this some thought and I realized this isn't my story anymore. It belongs to anyone who needs it. So you're in the driver's seat and you do whatever you want. And I said, well, why don't we at least co-author it because they're your words? And he said, no, it's your book. You do with it. And from that moment on, he was fine. And then he loved it. Then he used to come to my show, sign the books afterwards. He just loved that. He'd be waiting at the book signing table. Does anyone want the autograph of the father? Of course.
Oh, that's great. Jelaine is asking if you have a background in acting.
No, I don't. No, I fell into theater quite by accident. I was doing a reading from that book that never got published that I was trying to do too much from. I was doing a reading from it because someone had asked me, they knew I was working on a new book and they said, oh, would you just read from a work in progress, which I just gave me the heebie-jeebies, but I did it anyway. And someone in the audience came up and said, have you ever thought about doing theater? Because I love to embody the characters. I put on the voices and the gestures and everything. I said, no, I don't. I'm a writer. I just like doing animated readings. And he said, well, if you change your mind, here's my card. Wow. And to make a long story short, I changed my mind and I looked him up and we created, well, Confessions was our second show. The first show was something completely different. So I just really fell into it, but it was a great gift. It's one of the best gifts. One of the most valuable gifts I've ever been given was that.
How cool is that? Oh, I love it. My last question for you, and so if anybody else has questions, I'm going to open that up in a moment. But my last question is, if you were to do this all over again, is there something that you would do differently?
The writing of Confessions or my life?
Not your life. Let's not go there. You can write about that in your next memoir.
Well, it's kind of a minor thing, but I think I would. It was interesting to me when the book came out. My younger brother said to me, you said that you thought it was easiest for me. Dad's coming out was easiest for me because I was 9. So he was never told. My brother and I had the conversation where we were sat down and your father is gay. Well, my brother just grew up, Santa Claus parade in December, Pride Day parade in July. Like this, he just was brought up as a queer kid. Kid in a queer family. And I thought, oh, how great. It's just normal for him. And he said, it wasn't great. It wasn't normal. How do you think it felt when the day I realized everybody knew but me? and I was the one left to figure it out.
Mhm.
So I wished I'd had that conversation with him before. It would have involved me sending all the sections that had him in it to him. And then I think the reason I didn't do that, because then I would have had to send the sections that had to do with my older brother to him, and the sections that had to do with my mom to her, and the sections about my step family to them. I mean, I just don't like writing by committee. I admire and respect people who choose to do that. It's not that I don't take issue with that. It just wasn't something I was even considering. But I recognize that the manuscript would have been the richer for that. So that's if there's anything I would have done differently, it's that. And I would have had to figure out how to do it so it didn't feel like I had everybody in the room with their editorial suggestions.
Right. Right. That's something that I think we all wonder about how we're going to handle. And I think anyone who's in the process of writing a memoir, I say, don't even think about that until it's all done.
Oh yeah, definitely.
You have to write your story.
No, and when you start trying to please everybody else, the story suffers. Then the writer is the servant of the story only. Which doesn't mean we don't honor and respect the people in it, but we do not. If you have divided loyalties, the story falls apart. That is clear. So I think now just thinking about it, the way to have done it would have been to have a conversation with him rather than send the thing saying, my view of it was that you had the easier time of it because you were blah, blah, blah. Then he can have his 2 cents and I can choose how I want to incorporate that into the manuscript.
Mm-hmm. Jelaine is now asking if there is a way to see your show. Has it been recorded somewhere?
Well, actually, the answer is a no, in that there's a terrible archival recording with a video camera at the back of a theater, it's awful, and I hope it's no longer public. but I am the project that I spoke about earlier about remounting the show in 2023 was with an eye to film it properly, so there will be next year.
Excellent. Sylvia is asking, did writing help you come to terms with your story?
No. I had come to terms with the story, and that's why I was able to write it.
Okay.
My question is about memoir writing. When I'm trying to write my memoir, I still trying to get out from the trauma. I can't face those characters in my writing.
Yeah, and this is the processing that you were referring to in your last question. Did it help me process the story? I can't remember the verb you used. Did it help me resolve the story? I can't remember the way that you asked it, but this is a similar question, because the writing that we do to process the story, to create the distance that we need in order to have perspective on the story and be able to write about it, that writing tends to be for ourselves. So it's never intended to have a wider audience. That is the processing of the story. It's still the writer figuring out the story, or making peace with the story, or finding enough distance, separating enough from the story that we're now able to write about it. And with trauma, it's extremely difficult. And of course, it varies for every situation. But one exercise that can be helpful is to cast yourself in the third person. So rather than write it from your personal perspective, which can be so traumatizing and can re-traumatize the writer, which is the last thing we want, it can be helpful, and it can be the beginnings of separation from the story, to write yourself as the third person, she, and even change your name if that's helpful, and imagine the story as taking place outside of you. And it can be both a way to relieve that immediacy, but also to begin to see it as a story rather than my story. And even that has both literary and emotional advantages, no? Or there is a resonance of that can be very healing.
That's great advice. I think that's all the questions we have for you tonight. It's been so wonderful talking to you. Thank you so much for being so generous with your knowledge and with your time.
Pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me and for reading my book. I know there are lots of books to read, so I'm honored that you've chosen mine. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure, and a pleasure talking to you. Take care.
You too. Bye.